Hi, I'm Mark, producer of Roundtable, the TV series born here in New York City at the legendary Manhattan Neighborhood Network Studios. The exchange of ideas is important, and that is why we bring to you the following presentation. Please watch.
Good evening, and welcome to Single Shot at Manhattan Neighborhood Network's Roundtable. Helping artists, you helping a society. Helping a society, you helping artists. In order to discuss the complicated relationship between artist and society, which has a lot of angles and manifests it in many very unusual ways, we invited yet again Lawrence to join us today. Hello, Lawrence. Thanks for coming, and let's talk about this experience you had a couple of days ago. You was mentioned that you was passing by this gallery in which you was exhibited a while ago, and you've seen something amazing there, right?
Indeed. It actually wasn't a couple of days ago, it was minutes ago.
Oh,
on
really?
my way here.
It was
Yes.
today, actually.
It was today coming here, beautiful day out, and walked up, and lo and behold, I passed a gallery that was nearby here, and I had, looking in, I realized I had been there before. I can't remember if it was 5 years, 10 years ago. I don't know if it's been there that long, but yeah, indeed it was, I saw a piece that just drove me right in. And I looked at everything on the walls, and I don't remember exactly how many pieces, certainly 30. Every single one of them, phenomenal, amazing stuff, so accessible, so storytelling, so, I mean, jumping off the wall and saying, hey, you understand what I'm saying? And I'm like, yeah, I understand what each piece is saying. I mean, it was talking to me. It wasn't like I had to ponder and try to make something up. It just brought off all of these thoughts, brought these thoughts together that I've been having for a while, and every time I talk about it, and I speak about this in front of crowds sometimes, and I get people coming up to me. As a matter of fact, tonight we're going to go see the Shrinks, which is a band of, whether you want to or not, it's a band of psychiatrists. Who I met one of the members because I spoke at an event where I talked something about this, and he came up to me afterwards, and I'm talking about how being an artist, it makes you a better person. Looking at art makes you a better person. We know this, we've looked at this, we've seen by using scans of the brain what happens to a person's brain when they look at art or listen to music, or especially when they play music. That the brain gets wired up in ways that we never knew the brain could get wired up. We couldn't do these experiments previously.
I definitely knew that art is enriching humanity and human being who is enjoying art, but I didn't know that it's so direct and so medically provable.
Mm-hmm. And this fellow, who you're going to get to meet in a little while, he came up to me afterwards and he said, I just want to let you know I'm an artist, I'm a painter, and this, that, the other thing, and I'm also happen to be a musician, but my main focus is on neurological science.
Makes total sense to me.
And he said to me, there were certain points in your speech where it seemed like you were a little bit in doubt about what you were saying. And I'm here to tell you, you got it straight on. You got it completely right on. Everything that we do that relates to art, we think of art as, the dictionary definition of art is that it's man-made and useless. That is the dictionary,
No,
one of the
that's
dictionaries.
also a common tongue definition as well, maybe not in such a fancy vernacular, but definitely with the same essence. Essentially, if you would ask most of the people what they think of artists, if they don't create art themselves, and they would be comfortable enough to give their honest opinion, probably it would be in one way or another spelling that people believe that artists are parasites, and they don't realize that most of what we're actually experiencing is in one or other way due to art. Our economy is driven by art. people buying one or other model of the product not because they actually sat there for 5 hours and started which one is better, but because they like how it looks.
Mm-hmm.
The fashion industry, which is form of art on its own, is something that made this world to be changing so many times. And how many times there was a war that essentially was because one group of people looked at the other and they didn't like their fashion. And
Exactly.
I can't say how, in how many ways our favorite media changed the world. Photography is a reason why we experience in society we're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
Not to go any further, none of our modern way of buying things would exist if not for photography. People just wouldn't believe
That's
what
true.
they see if in one or other way they wouldn't be expecting it to be remotely similar to what they look at.
Mm-hmm.
But even going beyond just pure economical and historical impact, it's actually fascinating if art has such a direct involvement. It actually rewires the brains of the person who viewing it. Is it something temporal associated with the moment when a person looks at art, or it's the permanent change?
I think it's a permanent change. I mean, you'll be able to ask the man himself, but I believe that's what I'm understanding, is that it wires up the brain, and the wiring doesn't sort of disappear. It's making connections that are essentially more or less permanent. And, you know, imagine age and injury probably would take them away, but no, I think it's more or less permanent.
Well, that's
And so,
usually
just addressing something else you were just talking about is that we talked about the dictionary definition. One of the dictionary definitions, art, and man-made and useless. But there's the economic definition of art, which is the engine that drives society.
in
And
so
exactly
many
what
ways,
you were talking
exactly,
about.
yes.
I mean, would we buy so many new cars if they didn't change in every year, or fashion, or even the shaver? I mean, I didn't know what shaver to buy. You know, 2 blades, 3 blades, 4 blades, 5 blades. So I didn't buy any.
Well, it was a good choice if you would ask me. But getting back to the art, it's not only about the practical impact, really, and it really has something much deeper than that. Otherwise, yes, we would be probably choosing one or other item based on its design, but there are art pieces on our wall and they don't have any practical purpose if you would look at it. So the purpose actually is to change the environment, to change the way people interact with their surroundings in one way or another, and that's what we essentially create.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, exactly. And I think we had this conversation before. Maybe I even said it here last time, I'm not sure, but I have a strong belief that when somebody makes art, it's their job to show it somehow.
Indeed.
Even if it's just to one person, but you know, whatever is available for them to be able to show it, because the making of that work and then showing it, what you've done is you've essentially charged up 2 brains at the same time. Because we know that the action of a human looking at something that they understand as art, just because somebody says so, or it's on the wall in a frame, or just on the wall, just for that matter, that the action of looking at it wires up the brain to a higher level.
Oh,
And it doesn't matter if that work is good work or bad work. It doesn't matter if the person looking at it likes it or not. It's the action of looking at it. It's what makes us want to go over the hill.
Yes, on this particular moment we would be in disagreement. I personally do believe that art has a purpose, and its purpose is to make this world a better place. And essentially we agree into it, but we have somewhat different understanding of what actually makes this world a better place. I do believe that not every change is good, and just the fact that looking at the art piece changes something in a person is not enough. In my opinion, it has to be a change to the better. Whether giving this person a hope or giving him the power to will, the power to create something else, at least a reason to think. Don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about art necessarily being just promoting happiness and pink unicorns. There are a lot of art pieces that made a lot of good in this world, which are sad, which are depressing and not on a first glance doing something good on the immediate impact, but essentially on a long run these art pieces do create something good. Just to give you an instance, some of the photography that was depicting the saddest moments in human history, including, for example, the running girl from Vietnam, one of the iconic photos. It's one of the saddest and one of the most devastating photos, but this is a thought-provoking photo, which essentially gives an observer hope that if something is done, if it's addressed, that will not be repeated. Or at least reminding people that consequences of their actions can end up in a scene like this. It's easy to say, oh, we hate this country, let's bomb them. It's much harder to say it if you have in mind a running girl crying.
Exactly. I'm old enough to remember when that picture was first published. It completely, all to whatever, 200 million Americans here, and no matter what their position was before that picture was published, most of them changed their mind after it was published.
Well, if I recall, there was 2 images from Vietnamese time, and the second one was the execution by the revolver. If
Exactly.
You remember.
Yes, those two.
Yeah, they probably single-handedly made a change in public opinion about the war.
Exactly.
So we'll get back to this discussion after the break and continue trying to sort it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome to Single Trick at Single Shot. Today we're going to be talking about switching from digital to film. A lot of people do nowadays, and if you decided to do that, either just to try or as your conscious decision to switch altogether, there will be a lot of things you will need to learn and a lot of things you will need to change in the way you photograph. But there is one thing that is very important, and you will really have to know it in order to avoid major disappointments. In digital, as you probably know, if you take a photograph, you really have to make sure it's not overexposed. Otherwise, there is nothing you can do. In RAW, white is always white. You can't change it. In film, on the other hand, overexposed image can be corrected through development of the negative. But underexposure sometimes is completely fatal and final. So just make sure that you will change it underexposure for overexposure.
So unfortunately you guys missed what we was discussing during the break. We'll try to fill you in. And essentially I share the idea that yes, there are a lot of art pieces that making this world a better place in not immediately obvious ways, but there are some that making this world a worse place by the mere fact of their existence and especially by their popularity. And my example was famous Campbell's Soup by Andy Warhol, and I apparently was disagreed, so I'm dying to hear what is the reason to disagree with it.
So I'm older than you. I remember seeing that first Warhol Andy, that Campbell's Soup can, and the idea of it was outrageous, stupid, idiotic. First thoughts.
Natural, right?
Yeah, absolutely. How could this be art? But then I looked at it some more, and I'm a fan of Andy Warhol in a limited sense. I don't think that everything he did was great. There's a lot of stuff. A lot of his films are useless. I mean, I just don't get some of those things. I met some of those people who were in the factories and part of the films and part of all this stuff. And so I'm not a disciple of Andy Warhol, but those Campbell's Soup cans, I didn't know it until years later. They unlocked my creativity because I thought, wow, I do like this. There is something about this that is accessible, is relatable, is my life. My mother was the world's worst cook, so when she opened a can of Campbell's Soup, we knew we could eat that night.
I can imagine.
So, I'm going to disagree with you on that. And back to my thought before, which is that when an artist shows their work, again, whether it's good or bad, whether they like it or they don't, by looking at the work and processing it, their minds, their brains get wired up to a higher level. They become more of a human, more of an intelligent being because of what they are experiencing, what they have to do, what their brain has to do to cope with or to relate to this Campbell's Soup can.
Wow, that's
And it gives us
indeed very
something great to
interesting.
talk about.
Indeed. Well, I don't get me wrong. I totally agree that every person who feel a need to create art should be creating art. That's totally undeniable for me. The only thing that I have doubts about is simply a responsibility to the world. Because in my book, every piece of art, whether it's a photo or painting, sculpture, or even piece of clothing, is something that will essentially impact this world,
Yes.
make a change.
I would
So
agree.
I do believe that every artist, when they create it, the responsibility is not there. But the moment they show it, even to one person, they assume the responsibility for every single thing that this particular art piece will cause in the world.
I'm going to disagree with that.
Well, I would
I
really
can
love
think
to
of
see-
I can think of many songs for like I can't think of many songs, but I know it's happened many times that people have misrepresented somebody's song. Born in the USA is one of those. Bruce Springsteen. I happen to have been there the very first time he played that on stage, which was Madison Square Garden, and the interpretation was that it's an American, it's about being an American, but it's if you read the words, it's not really exactly that. Curiously enough, it was the conservatives, it was Republicans that picked that song up to use for their promotion of their agenda. When in fact the the words don't really support their positions.
Well, yeah.
So
it's-
with the misrepresentation, the artist can't be held responsible for that if that's the case.
But again, if we're talking about art piece provoking thinking process, any results of this thinking process is results of what artist created. So if the artist misunderstood, it doesn't mean that people wasn't advanced enough to understand this art piece. It means that it actually wasn't the art piece. It was embedded in it. That's why I'm talking about responsibility of the artist for every single consequence of existence of their artwork. I'm not talking about making it to be legal liability, don't get me wrong, but at least on a moral level, and that's exactly why I always cautious about saying that every art piece ever created should be displayed. That's where my basis for disagreement.
Okay.
Yes, creating it, definitely. Displaying it, it really have to be also part of the creative process in a way to realize whether or not you're actually ready to take responsibility for presenting this idea, this image, this approach to understanding of the world to the universe.
I might have this wrong, but it's I'm not a scholar in this way at all, but I believe Vincent van Gogh would have chosen not to show his work, if I'm not mistaken. It was his brother that insisted.
No, yeah, he actually was one of those artists who was actually trying to hide their work, and
Yeah.
if I recall correctly, it was only one piece sold throughout his whole
Yeah.
lifetime, and he wasn't happy about selling it at all. Well, that is more of an exception. Essentially, almost every artist I ever met, whether good, bad, talented, or completely mediocre, in my opinion, again, you have to always edit in this situation, in one way or another was hoping for being discovered, being understood, and being famous, essentially.
Mhm.
I guess urge to become famous is more of a driving force for most of the creative people than actually urge to get rich.
Hmm. Well, everybody wants to eat.
That's another.
And that sort of brings us
completely
back to
story,
what
yeah.
we were started this
Yes.
program talking about is, perhaps some level of focus should be on making it possible for. I don't think I got to mention that this place was called the Fountain House that I passed. We were talking about early on, and that what they do is they show the work of people who are mentally ill.
Wow.
And here it was. I'm seeing all these people who are mentally ill work on the wall, and I'm connecting with it very much. So obviously, I'm mentally ill too. And I didn't have to know that those works were made by mentally ill people to appreciate them. I didn't when I first walked in, because I don't think I knew that the last time I was there 5 or 10 years ago. And if we're talking about socioeconomics of art, then it certainly would seem to make sense that if we were, as a society, more fully supporting art, as all of our ancestor societies have, all of it, up until just 400 years ago, in every single language of the world that existed at the time, as I understand, I wasn't there, there was only one word that was used for art and science. That was always the same word. Artist and scientist was always the same word. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until 1938 in the Western world that we actually had our first split of art and science.
Actually, as a Russian speaker, I have to tell you that Russian apparently is not the case.
Okay.
It's two completely different words, both with very old roots. One is coming from knowledge. Obviously, that would be the science. And art is coming from the root related to skill, which is making it closer to craft in a way.
Okay.
Interesting separation.
It's an interesting separation, but I'm not so sure that they're so far apart.
Art and craft?
Yes.
Well, there is no exact border between them.
Okay. So I think we can say that a science fiction writer is more of an artist than a scientist, yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would
so
safely agree with it.
we have, I don't know how many, but millions of satellites that are stationed up in what's called the clock belt. It's called the clock belt because Arthur Clarke had written about it in one of his science fiction books. Now, in the meantime, NASA, or the scientists who are trying to get international communications going, they're thinking about this idea of putting satellites up, but how many do they need to keep going? And somebody said, well, maybe we can, put it where Arthur Clarke talked about. Arthur Clarke had the number even of how far out in space it had to be.
Wow.
It's now called the Clarke Belt, where we park our satellites.
Truly fascinating, and we'll have a few minutes to round it up after the break.
Okay. We'll have so much more to talk about. Can we stretch this?
Hello, Alex AG from Single Shot is here with yet another single trick. Today I want to tell you about front aperture. Everybody, for some reason, believes that aperture have to be in the middle of the lens, and I did so also. But at one point I've seen on eBay lenses that was actually made with aperture in front of them for conspicuously, and I started to look into it, and indeed you can have a lens that works just like this. Basically have it right in front of it, and it doesn't affect the way photograph is appearing. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that's actually the truth. But what is useful about it? If you have a piece of paper with shape in it, you can put it in front of the lens, and your highlights will be right in the shape of what this piece of paper is. Single trick, watch us on YouTube. Alright, so we was talking about art and science being essentially the same thing for most of the languages.
Well, not just the languages, but in reality. So, for example, all of the great temples and churches and theaters and castles and palaces, who built them? You can say, oh, they were architects. Well, there's a little more than just architecture involved here. And what is an architect? Isn't that sort of a big sculptor? Big scale sculptor? And, indeed, I mean, the first architects, they literally just put stones in place where they thought that was the right place. They didn't have the idea of sketching it out first. We know that. But, later on, they did sketch it out. But wait a minute. Those same architects were also the people that were putting art on the wall, because they're thinking of the light coming in here, and maybe that's a great place to put a sculpture or a painting or whatever it might be.
Positively.
Exactly. Or just the emotional experience of entering an entranceway, what it looks like from the outside, what it looks like before you even got to the front, the lawn or something. They're sculpting a lawn, they're sculpting the stairs, they're sculpting the doorway itself, and then the way the door opens and how expansive it might be to walk into the entrance room, and all of these things are. So what I say to you about that is I'm pretty sure that science and art are intrinsically linked. That indeed, I happen recently, 3-4 years ago, became good friends with a fellow who is the head of NYU Medical Cardiology or something. He's the top guy there, and he's also a guitar player. You might say, oh, that's just a hobby. Yeah, it's just a hobby, but it's what makes things think. Einstein was asked in one of his last interviews, he was asked a simple question. He said, how did you come up with that big one? How did you come up with E = mc squared, the theory of relativity? And he said, oh, that one was easy. I was playing my violin, and there it was.
Well, definitely proof of this theory.
Exactly.
Well, what can I say? Let's hope that this theory would actually bring some practical fruits which would explain how we can actually use this wiring to make this world a better place. It's really something that we could find helpful in our society, and indeed trying to promote art by definition is something that we're all missing, and directing our resources and our efforts in the right way would be very helpful.
There we go.
Alright, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure and very insightful conversation.
Definitely.
I hope you found that worth watching as much as I did. I'm Mark for Roundtable. Thanks for watching. See you next week.